a center by the name of Cliff Amore. The center from Rutgers. He was highly sought after in the transfer portal. Most everybody was in after him originally. He cut his list to 12. Alabama was on that list of 12. And then we start hearing, he's going to be visiting a few places. And, if Alabama can get a visit, then we really like our chances. Alabama has done a really, really good job this year. The 4 guys they had visit, all committed. 3 of them committed while on visits. Houston Millett, I think, was just after his visit. But Chris Youngblood and Aiden Holloway both were on the visit themselves. And then Cliff, we were not the last visit. There was a UNC visit just after us. And Aiden ends up committing to Alabama. The benefit to this is, first off, Alabama won a recruiting battle where we were not the highest NIL offer. Alabama, it was reported by Joe Tipton, that Cliff had an offer of $2 million on the table that he turned down to come to Alabama. From the numbers that I have heard or have seen, Alabama's offer was somewhere in the 1.4 to 1.5 range. So, it's a pretty substantial difference to the $2 million. But it was, Alabama still definitely ponied up a substantial amount of money when it comes to that. His number is really one of the only ones that we know because of so many teams and people competing for him. The numbers were a little bit more out in the open compared to some of the other guys. But from a Cliff standpoint, what is he? He's an incredible shot blocker, and he plays above the rim, right? So Cliff is what we were missing on last year's team. When you look at the numbers, so I have his numbers pulled up here in front of me. Last year he averaged 10 and 8, as well as almost 3 blocks a game. He averaged 2.9 blocks a game, while only averaging 2.6 fouls in 27 minutes, right? So it's a standpoint where he's playing and he's not fouling out. If I remember correctly, I think he only fouled out of 1, 2, 3, 4 games last season. He only fouled out of 4 games last season, and he was much more of the main go-to guy for Rutgers, right? He was their key centerpiece for that Rutgers team. They were playing, their offense was not very good, so they were trying to play through him as much as they could. From a defensive standpoint, they were pretty good on defense. I think that he had a decent bit to do with that, being the shot blocker that he was, right? The other thing that when you look at Cliff and when you look at the stats, right, Cliff was, as I mentioned, he was third. So he was third in the country in block shots. His block rate was 12.7%. So just absolutely incredible from a rim protection standpoint. And it wasn't just this past year, right? The year before last, he was 22nd in the country with a 9% block rate. So he's been top 25 in America back-to-back seasons in block rate. Then something that the Southeastern 14 guys pointed out in their breakdown, and if you haven't seen it, they broke down Cliff Amore as well. Go give it a listen. But something they broke down and pointed out was his defensive rebound rate, right? Alabama's best defensive rebounder last season was Grant Nelson, and it was at about 17%. Cliff's defensive rebound rate has not been below 23% his entire college career. 23.1% is the lowest he's had his entire career, right? So this would be Nate Oates' best rebounder that he's had, because he's even a better rebounder than Noah Clowney was. Noah Clowney was Nate's prior best rebounder that he had as coach of Alabama and as a head coach. So you're adding somebody in Cliff that does some things that Alabama has not been that great at here recently. We had some shot blocking with Betty Iko, but honestly, Chuck was not an elite shot blocker. He was good in drop coverage, and he was good for what we tried to do, but he was not an elite rim protector. Cliff is a much better rim protector than Chuck was. the other thing when you're looking at what he has the ability to do is Cliff gives you the ability, when it was getting down to who was Alabama going to get for the center spot, because this is the spot that everybody's been talking about. It was the spot that was missing from last year's team, and it's the spot that we needed to fill for this coming team so that Grant could play the 4. It was down to Cliff Amore and Ugonna Onyenso from Kentucky. And the benefit that you get with Cliff over Ugonna is Cliff is a much better offensive option. Now, as you know, with Nate Oates' system, we do not play through the 5, right? However, it is very helpful, especially down the stretch when you're playing against bigger teams, when you're playing, in March, to be able to go inside, say shots aren't falling, you can kick it inside and, play through a guy that can get a bucket. It's super helpful with that. It's also somebody that he thrives in the alley-oop. When you look and when you watch the highlights of Cliff, there's a lot of alley-oops. There's a lot of dunks. He's a very powerful guy. And this is definitely not the right player type, but I would look at it as a taller, better shot blocking version of like Pringle, right? Obviously a much better offensive option, but an athlete that absolutely thrives above the rim, right? And that's something that in Nate Oates' style does well, right? We've seen the alley-oops that they throw for Pringle. I would expect to see some of those for Cliff, right? Like I said, if you get a chance, go watch the highlight tape on YouTube, just some of the transfer portal highlight tapes that people put out when somebody enters the portal. Cliff's has a ton of dunks. There are a ton of block shots. There's a poster on Zach Edey, right? Like, at the end of the day, Cliff also played in the Big Ten. So he played in a very big conference against really good big men, right? He played against Zach Edey. He played against some of these guys in the Big Ten. He was, pushed around against these guys. He's been a 4-year player. So this is somebody that you're getting as a grad transfer that is not going to be afraid of the moment. He's not going to be, worried about who he's playing or this or that. It's going to be completely fine because Cliff's going to be in his element, and this is the team that plays a style that's potentially to help get him to the NBA, which is where he eventually wants to be, right? So that is the benefit to Cliff. In short, Cliff is your starting 5-man. I think that it goes without saying. The benefit to that is, as I mentioned earlier, it allows Grant Nelson to shift down to the 4 because of that as well. And we'll talk about the incoming guys later in another episode. But we also have coming in Aiden Sherrill. Aiden Sherrill is another natural 5-man. And so it allows Grant to always play the 4. If we move him to the 5, it's solely based on a certain lineup and a certain skill set that we're trying to do in that moment at that time. We're not forced to put him at the 5. I would honestly expect him to not be at the 5 very much next season. I would expect him to be at the 4 much more next season, just because having Cliff and having Aiden gives you the ability to play Grant at the position that he's most comfortable. Same thing with Jaren, right? I expect Jaren to be mostly playing the 4. If he's playing the 5, it's going to be mostly in a very small ball standpoint. But again, not because he's required to, but all 4 of those guys being 6'11" is absolutely massive, right? It gives you variability. It gives you the ability to, change around lineups as the situation permits. So, I mean, that's huge. And I think that Cliff is a huge, huge, huge missing piece. And that's the reason why if Mark Sears comes back, this is going to be a team that is looked at as a top 2 team coming into next season. They're already on some early rankings. On3 put out their early rankings and has Alabama as number 1. I know some other people have Alabama as number 2 behind Kansas. But Alabama's roster with Cliff at the 5 and the incoming players that they have, I mean, you're looking at a bottom 3 of Mo Diabate, Naz Cunningham, and LeBaron Philon. Philon and Cunningham, you could argue, both could contribute much more than I would expect. I'm not sure exactly what to expect out of them this coming season just because of who we have. But they're both, top 40 recruits. Nas Cunningham was the number one overall recruit a few years ago. He's dropped in the rankings after going to overtime elite, but he's still an elite player, right? LeBaron Philon averaged 35 points a game when he was in Mobile, goes to Link Academy, does really, really well, continues averaging big numbers, commits to Kansas. Alabama's his dream school. We have a spot open up, and he gets to Alabama, right? If those three guys are your bottom of the roster, you got to love your chances. You got to love where this team and this roster is at. This is definitely going to be the most talented roster Nate Oates has had at his time in Tuscaloosa. I think this will eclipse the roster. Maybe not from a wins perspective. That ceases to be seen. Alabama's only had one team ever cross 30 wins. So not sure if this team would do that. But I think that their ability is up there, right? They have that ability. Now, will they do it? That we will have to see. That's why the games are played. But the sheer talent and ability of this team will absolutely be one that can compete with some of the best teams in Alabama history. And it would not surprise me if this team was to go down as the best that Alabama basketball has ever had. And competing for a title is something that will be the expectation this coming season.